My father stood in the walnut-paneled office where I'd signed my first lease 3 years earlier and told me I was no longer the owner. His jaw was set, his voice steady, as if he were announcing a quarterly earnings report rather than unraveling everything I'd built from scratch. Behind him, my half-brother Marcus, 22, fresh out of business school, and utterly clueless about the difference between a demi-glaze and a bechamel, leaned against the desk with a smirk that made my stomach twist. The papers in my father's hand bore the corporate letterhead of Harrington Holdings, the private equity firm he'd founded decades ago, and my signature at the bottom, obtained, I later learned, through a clause buried in the investor agreement I signed when I was desperate for startup capital. "Real men don't cook, Julian," he said, his eyes cold and certain. "Real men build empires." I stood there in my chef's whites, flour still dusting my forearms from the morning's croissant prep, and felt the ground shift beneath me. The bistro, Mon Coeur, my heart, named after my late mother's nickname for me, was no longer mine. Marcus would take over operations immediately, my father explained, while I could stay on as a culinary consultant, if I agreed not to make a fuss. The injustice of it burned through my chest like a badly tuned oven, but I didn't shout or plead. I simply nodded, removed my apron, and walked out into the October drizzle, my mind already calculating angles and possibilities. What my father didn't know, what Marcus couldn't possibly understand, was that I'd spent the last 6 months quietly documenting every transaction, every supplier relationship, every recipe that made Mon Coeur the most sought-after reservation in the city. And what none of us knew that afternoon was that in exactly 18 months, I would receive a phone call that would change everything. The bistro had started as a dream sketched on napkins during my culinary school years in Lyon. I'd spent 5 years in France after high school, apprenticing under chefs who taught me that cooking wasn't just technique, it was a language of care, a way to make strangers feel seen. My mother, who'd passed away from cancer when I was 16, had always encouraged my interest in food. She'd been the one to teach me her grandmother's cassoulet recipe, the one to tell me that feeding people was one of the purest forms of love. My father, Arthur Harrington, had tolerated my culinary ambitions only because he assumed I'd eventually grow out of it and join him in finance. When I returned to Boston at 25 with a Le Cordon Bleu certificate and a head full of ideas, he'd been dismissive but pragmatic. He offered me seed capital, $300,000, in exchange for a 49% stake in whatever restaurant I opened. I'd hesitated, but rent in the South End was astronomical, and the perfect location had just become available. A converted carriage house with exposed brick, high ceilings, and enough square footage for 35 covers. I signed the papers without reading every clause, too eager to start building. Mon Coeur opened on a rainy March evening 3 years ago. The menu was small and personal: duck confit with cherry gastrique, seared scallops over saffron risotto, a chocolate fondant that took 18 minutes to bake and had to be ordered at the start of the meal. I hired a team of 6, line cooks who cared about provenance, a sous chef named Renata who could butcher a lamb with surgical precision, and a front-of-house manager named Claire who remembered every regular's preference. We built a reputation one plate at a time, earning write-ups in Boston Magazine and a glowing review from the Globe's food critic that called the space a love letter to French technique filtered through New England sensibility. My father attended the opening night, ordered the steak frites, and left halfway through dessert. He never came back. But his firm, Harrington Holdings, sent quarterly reports tracking our revenue, our table turnover rate, our cost per cover. I assumed it was standard investor oversight. I didn't realize he was waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came 3 weeks ago, when Marcus graduated from Wharton with an MBA and no clear career path. My father had always favored Marcus, the son of his second wife, a polished woman named Diane who threw charity galas and never let her nails chip. Marcus had grown up in the same Beacon Hill townhouse where I'd spent my childhood, but our experiences couldn't have been more different. He'd been groomed for boardrooms, I'd been tolerated as a creative outlier. When my father decided Marcus needed a real-world project to cut his teeth on, Mon Coeur became the obvious choice. Not because Marcus had any interest in hospitality, but because it was mine, and taking it would prove a point.
The takeover happened swiftly and legally. The investor agreement I'd signed included a clause that allowed Harrington Holdings to assume operational control if the restaurant's profitability fell below a certain threshold for 2 consecutive quarters. We hadn't fallen below that threshold, our margins were healthy, our reservation book full 2 months out, but my father's firm had the authority to redefine the threshold based on revised market projections. A team of lawyers had reinterpreted our numbers, declared us underperforming, and executed the clause. By the time I understood what was happening, Marcus had already held a staff meeting, announcing himself as the new owner and outlining his vision for scaling the brand. I sat in that meeting, my hands clenched under the table, listening to Marcus describe plans to expand Moncour into a chain. He wanted to open 10 locations within 2 years, each one a carbon copy of the original, with centralized prep kitchens and pre-portioned ingredients shipped in vacuum-sealed bags. He spoke about operational efficiency and reducing labor costs as if he were describing a widget factory, not a place where people came to celebrate anniversaries and mourn losses over bowls of French onion soup. Claire, my front-of-house manager, glanced at me with barely concealed horror. Renata stared at the table, jaw tight. After the meeting, I pulled Claire aside in the alley behind the restaurant. The October air smelled like wet leaves and exhaust. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. I told her I didn't know yet, but that she should start looking for a new job. Marcus would likely fire anyone who seemed loyal to me. She shook her head. "This is bullshit, Julian. This place is yours." I appreciated her anger, but anger without strategy was just noise. I needed a plan. That night, I went home to my studio apartment in Jamaica Plain and spread every document related to Moncour across the floor. Contracts, supplier agreements, receipts, the original business plan I'd written in a feverish 3-day sprint. I read through the investor agreement again, this time with a lawyer's scrutiny, and found something interesting. The clause that allowed Harrington Holdings to assume control also stipulated that if the restaurant achieved a certain level of recognition, specifically a Michelin star or equivalent accolade, the operational authority would revert to the original founder. It was a standard provision meant to protect visionary creators from being ousted just as their work gained prestige. My father's lawyers had probably assumed it would never apply. After all, Boston had no Michelin guide, and the only comparable recognition, the James Beard Awards, was notoriously difficult to win. Boston had just announced they were expanding their North American coverage. Boston was on the list. I sat back against the wall, my mind racing. If I could somehow earn a Michelin star, I could reclaim Moncour. But there was a problem. I was no longer the chef de cuisine. Marcus had installed his own hire, a flashy cook named Todd who'd worked at a hotel restaurant chain and specialized in modernist techniques that looked impressive on Instagram but tasted like chemistry experiments. The food at Moncour was already starting to change. Todd had replaced my duck confit with a deconstructed ductarian served with edible flowers and a balsamic reduction that tasted like cough syrup. If I wanted to win back my restaurant, I'd have to build something new, something undeniable, and I'd have to do it fast.
The day after the takeover, I emptied my locker at Moncour and walked out without saying goodbye. It felt like a death, clean and absolute. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had my knives, my notebooks, and 3 years of contacts. I also had something Marcus didn't, a reputation among the people who actually mattered in this city's food scene. The farmers at the markets, the fishmongers at the docks, the pastry suppliers who knew I paid on time and never sent back product without cause. I spent the next week reaching out quietly. I called Renata first. She answered on the second ring, her voice wary. "Julian, I was wondering when you'd call." I asked her if she was happy working under Todd. There was a long pause. "He used pre-made demi-glaze yesterday," she said finally, "from a box." I laughed despite myself. "Want to help me start over?" Another pause. "Where?" I told her I didn't know yet, but that I'd figure it out. "I'm in," she said. "Just tell me when." Claire was harder to convince. She had a mortgage and a daughter in middle school. She couldn't afford to gamble on a ghost of a restaurant. I understood. But she agreed to help me scout locations on her days off, and she passed along intel from inside Moncour. Marcus was hemorrhaging reservations. Regulars were complaining about the new menu, and Todd had already gotten into a screaming match with the line cooks. The place was fracturing. I found the new space in early November, tucked into a narrow alley in Cambridge near Kendall Square. It had been a Portuguese bakery that closed during a pandemic, its windows papered over, its ovens cold. The rent was steep but manageable, and the landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Alvarez, who remembered my mother from a hospital fundraiser years ago, gave me a 6-month lease with an option to renew. The space was smaller than Moncour, with room for only 22 covers, but it had good bones. A brick oven, a prep kitchen with enough counter space, and a tiny courtyard out back where I could eventually grow herbs. I named it Ember. Simple, elemental, a nod to the idea of starting from scratch. Renata and I spent 3 weeks cleaning and renovating, doing most of the work ourselves to save money. We stripped the floors, repainted the walls a soft cream, and installed open shelving for plates and glassware. I bought mismatched chairs from estate sales and refinished them in my apartment. The aesthetic was deliberately humble. No pretense, no flourishes, just good light and honest surfaces. I wanted the food to do the talking. The menu at Ember was smaller and more focused than Moncour's had been. I built it around ingredients that could be sourced within 50 miles. Line-caught cod from Gloucester, heirloom squash from a farm in Concord, butter from a dairy in Vermont. Each dish told a story of place. The opening menu featured 6 plates: roasted beets with chèvre and walnut oil, pan-seared cod with brown butter and capers, a pork chop with apple compote, a winter vegetable tart, and 2 desserts, a pear tart tatin and a dark chocolate mousse with sea salt. Nothing flashy, nothing trendy, just flavor built on technique. We opened Ember quietly in late November, with no publicity and no reservation system, just a chalkboard by the door listing the night's menu and a promise to seat people as space allowed. I expected a slow start, maybe a handful of curious locals. Instead, we had a line out the door. Word had spread through the food community about what had happened at Moncour, and people came to Ember not out of pity, but out of loyalty to the cooking they remembered. Our first night, we served 43 covers in 5 hours, and I worked a line until my hands cramped and my back screamed. Renata plated desserts with the precision of a watchmaker. We ran out of the pork chop by 8:30 and had to improvise a lamb dish on the fly. The reviews came fast. A blogger called Ember a masterclass in restraint. The Boston Globe's critic returned 3 times in 2 weeks and wrote that the roasted beets were a revelation of sweetness and earth. A food Instagram account with 200,000 followers posted a photo of the tart tatin with the caption, "This is what cooking should taste like." Every mention felt like vindication, but I didn't let myself relax. Michelin inspectors were notoriously secretive, and there was no way to know if they'd even visited. All I could do was cook like my life depended on it. Around this time, something unexpected happened. Marcus called me. It was a Sunday afternoon in mid-December, and I was at Ember, prepping for the evening service, peeling carrots, dicing onions, the meditative work that kept my hands busy and my mind clear. My phone buzzed on the counter, and his name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Julian," he said, his voice strained, "we need to talk." I asked him what he wanted. "The restaurant's struggling. Reservations are down 30%. Todd quit last week. Dad thinks we should rebrand. Maybe bring you back as a consultant." I set down my knife and stared at the pile of carrot peelings. My first instinct was to tell him to go to hell. But something stopped me, a cold, calculating part of my brain that saw an opportunity. I told Marcus I'd think about it and call him back. Then I hung up and started making a list. The list had 2 columns, what I knew about Moncour's current operations and what I could leverage. Marcus had expanded too fast, opening 3 new locations in the suburbs using the chain model he'd pitched. The food was mediocre, the staff undertrained, and the brand was diluting. Meanwhile, Ember was thriving on a shoestring budget, earning the kind of organic buzz that money couldn't buy. If Marcus was desperate enough to call me, it meant my father was starting to realize his mistake. And if Michelle called, if I could somehow pull off a star,
I wouldn't just reclaim Moncour, I'd reclaim everything. But first, I had to survive the winter service and keep Ember's quality razor sharp. Every plate mattered. Every review mattered. I was cooking not just for the people in the dining room, but for the invisible judges who might be among them, tasting and taking notes and deciding my future. Around this time, something unexpected happened. Marcus called me. It was a Sunday afternoon in mid-December, and I was at Ember, prepping for the evening service, peeling carrots, dicing onions, the meditative work that kept my hands busy and my mind clear. My phone buzzed on the counter, and his name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. "Julian," he said, his voice strained, "we need to talk." I asked him what he wanted. "The restaurant's struggling. Reservations are down 30%. Todd quit last week. Dad thinks we should rebrand, maybe bring you back as a consultant." I set down my knife and stared at the pile of carrot peelings. My first instinct was to tell him to go to hell. But something stopped me, a cold, calculating part of my brain that saw an opportunity. I told Marcus I'd think about it and call him back. Then I hung up and started making a list. The list had 2 columns, what I knew about Moncour's current operations and what I could leverage. Marcus had expanded too fast, opening 3 new locations in the suburbs using the chain model he'd pitched. The food was mediocre, the staff undertrained, and the brand was diluting. Meanwhile, Ember was thriving, on a shoestring budget, earning the kind of organic buzz that money couldn't buy. If Marcus was desperate enough to call me, it meant my father was starting to realize his mistake. And if Michelle called, if I could somehow pull off a star, I wouldn't just reclaim Moncour, I'd reclaim everything. But first, I had to survive the winter service and keep Ember's quality razor sharp. Every plate mattered. Every review mattered. I was cooking not just for the people in the dining room, but for the invisible judges who might be among them, tasting and taking notes and deciding my future.
January brought snow and a strange, brittle tension. Ember stayed busy despite the cold, with regulars bundling in from the slush and newcomers braving the weather after reading about us online. I added a beef short rib to the menu, braised for 8 hours until the meat fell apart at the touch of a fork, served over creamy polenta with a red wine reduction. It became our most requested dish. Renata perfected a lemon tart that was so bright and sharp it made people close their eyes and sigh. We were finding our rhythm, the kind of wordless coordination that comes only from repetition and trust. In mid-January, a couple came in on a Tuesday night, quiet, well-dressed, with an air of careful observation. They ordered the full menu, from the beet salad to the short rib to both desserts, and took their time with each course. The woman made notes in a small leather journal. The man tasted everything twice, chewing slowly, his expression unreadable. I watched them from the pass, my pulse quickening. Michelin inspectors didn't announce themselves, and their visits were designed to be anonymous. But something about this pair felt different, professional, assessing. They left without saying a word, and I spent the next week wondering if I'd imagined it. Then, in early February, another couple came in with the same deliberate energy. Then a solo diner who ordered off-menu items, testing our flexibility. I started to feel like I was walking a tightrope, every plate a potential verdict. On Valentine's Day, we were slammed. 56 covers in a space built for 22. People crammed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the smell of butter and rosemary and caramelized sugar. I worked the line with Renata, calling orders, plating dishes, moving in the controlled chaos that felt like a kind of prayer. Near the end of the night, a woman in her 50s approached the kitchen window. She introduced herself as Eleanor Moss, a food writer for a national magazine. "I'd love to do a profile on you," she said. "The story of Ember and what happened at Moncour. People need to hear it." I hesitated. Publicity could help, but it could also backfire. Paint me as bitter or vindictive, turn the narrative into a soap opera rather than a story about cooking. Eleanor seemed to sense my reluctance. "I'm not interested in drama," she said. "I'm interested in resilience. Let me tell it right." I agreed, on the condition that she'd focus on the food first and the backstory second. She smiled. Deal. The profile ran in March, a 6-page spread with photos of Ember's cramped kitchen, Renata's hands shaping dough, and a close-up of the short rib that looked like a painting. The headline read, "From Dispossession to Devotion, How One Chef Rebuilt His Dream in a Cambridge Alley." The article was fair and thorough, detailing my father's takeover without sensationalizing it, emphasizing instead the quiet determination that had gone into Ember. It ended with a line that made my throat tighten. In a city full of noise and ambition, Ember reminds us that the best cooking comes from a place of necessity and love. The response was immediate. Our reservation wait time jumped to 6 weeks. Food bloggers flew in from New York and D.C. A James Beard Foundation scout emailed to say I was on their radar for a Rising Star nomination. And then, on a rainy afternoon in late March, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, crisp and professional. "Mr. Harrington, this is Sophie Laurent from the Michelin Guide. I'm calling to inform you that Ember has been awarded 1 Michelin star in this year's Boston edition. Congratulations." I stood in the prep kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and couldn't speak. Sophie continued, explaining that the ceremony would be held in 2 weeks, that I'd receive an official plaque and certificate, that the announcement would go public the following Monday. I managed to thank her before the call ended, and then I sank onto a milk crate and stared at the ceiling. Renata found me there 5 minutes later. "What happened?" I told her. She whooped so loud it echoed off the brick walls, and then she hugged me, flour from her apron dusting my chef's coat. That night, I didn't tell anyone else. I needed to sit with it first, to let the reality settle in my chest. A Michelin star. It wasn't just a professional milestone, it was a weapon. According to the investor agreement I'd signed with my father, the star triggered the reversion clause. Operational control of Moncour would return to me, the original founder, within 30 days of the accolade being confirmed. My father's lawyers would have to honor it. The empire he'd tried to build through Marcus would crumble. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for the ceremony and quietly consulting with my own lawyer, a sharp woman named Gabrielle Tran, who specialized in business disputes. She reviewed the contract and confirmed what I already knew. The clause was ironclad. Once the Michelin announcement went public, I could file for reinstatement. Gabrielle also pointed out something else. If Marcus had continued to expand Moncour under the original LLC, and if those locations were failing, I could potentially claim damages and force a dissolution of the entire chain. It would be messy and expensive, but it was possible. The Michelin ceremony took place at a hotel ballroom downtown, a glittering affair with champagne and speeches and chefs from across the city dressed in their whites. When they called my name and handed me the plaque, the room erupted in applause. I saw colleagues I hadn't spoken to in months, competitors who'd watched my fall and rise with a mix of respect and envy. I gave a short speech, thanking Renata and the team, my mother's memory, and the farmers and suppliers who'd believed in Ember. I didn't mention my father or Marcus. I didn't need to. The announcement went public the next morning. By noon, my phone was flooded with messages, congratulations, interview requests, and one terse email from my father's assistant requesting a meeting. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked into Gabrielle's office with a coffee and a plan. "File the reinstatement claim," I told her, "and let's talk about damages." She grinned. "Thought you'd never ask."
The legal process moved faster than I expected. Within a week of the Michelin announcement, Gabriel filed a formal claim with the Massachusetts Superior Court, citing the reversion clause in the investor agreement and demanding that operational control of Moncour be returned to me immediately. She also filed a secondary claim for financial damages, arguing that Marcus's mismanagement had devalued the brand and caused reputational harm that I, as the original founder, was entitled to recover. My father's legal team responded with a flurry of motions, trying to argue that the clause was invalid or that the Michelin star didn't meet the criteria outlined in the contract. But the language was clear, and Gabriel had built an airtight case. The first hearing was scheduled for mid-April, in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor polish. My father sat on the opposite side of the room, flanked by 3 lawyers in expensive suits. Marcus wasn't there. Gabriel had heard through the grapevine that he'd already stepped back from day-to-day operations, overwhelmed and out of his depth. My father's face was unreadable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when the judge entered. The hearing lasted 2 hours. Gabriel presented the contract, the Michelin certification, and a timeline of events showing how my father's firm had manipulated the profitability threshold to justify the takeover. She also introduced evidence of declining revenues at Moncur and its 3 satellite locations, arguing that Marcus's expansion strategy had been reckless and damaging. My father's lawyers tried to pivot, claiming that the reversion clause was meant to apply only to Moncur itself, not to any derivative businesses. But Gabriel countered that all 3 satellite locations were operating under the original LLC, which meant they were legally part of the same entity. If I regained control of Moncur, I regained control of the entire chain. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Honorable Patricia Klein, listened carefully and asked pointed questions. At the end of the hearing, she announced that she would issue a ruling within 10 days. As we filed out of the courtroom, my father approached me in the hallway. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his face lined with something that might have been regret or just exhaustion. "Julian," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I told him there was nothing to discuss. He'd made his choice when he took the restaurant, and I'd made mine by rebuilding. He shook his head. "I underestimated you. I thought—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. I waited, curious despite myself. Finally, he said, "I thought you'd give up. Go work for someone else. Prove me right." I felt a strange cold clarity settle over me. "You didn't take the restaurant to teach me a lesson," I said. "You took it because you couldn't stand the idea that I succeeded without you, that I built something you didn't understand." He didn't deny it. We stood there in the fluorescent-lit hallway, 2 men who'd once been father and son, and then I turned and walked away. The ruling came down 8 days later. Judge Klein sided with me on every count. Operational control of Moncur and its satellite locations would revert to me immediately, and my father's firm was ordered to pay damages totaling $270,000, a sum calculated based on lost revenue and reputational harm. The decision also stipulated that Harrington Holdings would retain its financial stake in the business, but only as a passive investor, with no decision-making authority. My father would still profit if the restaurant succeeded, but he'd have no say in how they were run. The news hit the local food scene like a thunderclap. Articles appeared in the Globe, Boston Magazine, and national outlets, framing the story as a David and Goliath tale of culinary justice. Chefs I barely knew sent congratulatory texts. Renana baked a celebratory cake with "Owner" written in chocolate ganache. Claire, who'd stayed on at Moncur through the chaos, called to tell me the staff was ecstatic. "Todd's gone," she said, her voice bright, "and everyone's asking when you're coming back." I told her I'd be there the next day. But first, I had to see the damage for myself. I walked into Moncur on a Thursday afternoon, my old key still working in the lock. The dining room looked the same walnut tables, same exposed brick, but it felt hollow, like a stage set waiting for actors. The kitchen was worse. The mise en place stations were cluttered and organized, the floor sticky, the walk-in freezer packed with pre-portioned ingredients in vacuum-sealed bags. I found a stack of invoices on the desk in the office, bills from suppliers I'd never used, contracts with food distributors that prioritized cost over quality. Marcus had gutted everything that made Moncur special and replaced it with a business model designed for scale, not soul. I spent the rest of the day taking inventory and making lists. I called my original suppliers, the farm in Concord, the dairy in Vermont, the fishmonger in Gloucester, and told them I was back. Most of them had stopped working with Moncur under Marcus, unwilling to compromise their standards. They welcomed me back without hesitation. I also called the staff, asking them to meet me for a kitchen meeting the next morning. Not everyone returned. Some had found jobs elsewhere, and I didn't blame them. But enough did that I could rebuild the core team. The hardest decision was what to do with the satellite locations. The 3 restaurants Marcus had opened were bleeding money, their reputations already tarnished by mediocre food and poor service. I could try to salvage them, pour time and resources into retraining staff and overhauling menus. Gabriel advised the latter. "You can't be in 4 places at once," she said, "and trying to save something broken will just drain you." She was right. I announced the closures the following week, offering severance packages to the staff and issuing a public statement explaining that I was returning to Moncour's original mission, a single, intimate space where quality mattered more than quantity. The closures made headlines, but the response was mostly supportive. People understood. They'd watched Marcus try to turn a beloved neighborhood bistro into a corporate franchise, and they'd seen it fail. What they wanted now was the food they remembered, the care and craft that had made Moncour worth waiting for. I spent the next month rebuilding. I repainted the kitchen, restocked the pantry, and rewrote the menu to reflect the seasons. Spring peas and lamb, fresh greens and strawberries, dishes that felt alive and immediate. Renata came back as sous chef, and Claire stayed on as front-of-house manager. We reopened Moncour on a soft May evening, the windows open to let in the smell of blooming magnolias, and the reservation book filled within hours. On opening night, my father came. He didn't make a reservation, just walked in and asked if there was space at the bar. I saw him from the kitchen and felt a flicker of anger, but also something else. Weariness, maybe? Or acceptance. I nodded to Claire, and she seated him. He ordered the duck confit, my mother's favorite dish, and ate it slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he left a $100 bill on the bar and walked out without speaking to me. I never saw him again.
Summer brought a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Moncour was busy but manageable, the kind of busy that comes from earned reputation rather than hype. Regulars returned, couples who'd celebrated anniversaries there, families who came for Sunday dinners, solo diners who sat at the bar with a book and a glass of wine. The menu evolved with the seasons, incorporating tomatoes and corn and stone fruit, dishes that tasted like sunlight and rain. Renata experimented with a peach tart that became a sensation, its crust so flaky it shattered at the first bite, the fruit roasted until it was almost jammy. We added it to the permanent menu by August. Ember, meanwhile, continued to thrive in its own quiet way. I'd hired a young chef named Miguel to run the kitchen there, a talented cook who'd worked under me at Moncour and understood the philosophy. Simple ingredients, precise technique, no shortcuts. Miguel brought his own voice to Ember, adding a ceviche dish inspired by his Peruvian grandmother and a braised chicken with green olives that became an instant favorite. I visited twice a week, tasting and offering notes, but mostly I let him lead. Ember wasn't mine anymore, not in the same possessive way Moncour had been. It was a shared project, a testament to what could happen when you trusted people to care as much as you did. In September, the James Beard Foundation announced its semi-finalists for the Rising Star Chef Award. My name was on the list. The ceremony wouldn't be until the following spring, but the nomination alone felt like a validation of everything I'd fought for. Gabrielle sent a congratulatory email with a champagne emoji. Claire baked a cake at Moncour with JBA semi-finalist written in buttercream. I felt grateful, but also oddly detached. The awards and recognition mattered, but they weren't why I cooked. I cooked because it was the language I knew best, the way I made sense of the world and connected with people who might never know my name. That fall, something unexpected happened. I received a letter from Marcus. It arrived at Moncour in a plain envelope, handwritten on expensive stationery. He apologized for what had happened, admitting that he'd been in over his head and that he'd let our father manipulate him into believing he was ready to run a restaurant. He wrote that he'd left Boston and was working in finance in New York, a job that suited him better. He didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, just wanted me to know that he understood, now, what he'd taken from me. I read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in a drawer. I didn't respond. Some wounds healed better without words. In October, I received a call from a documentary filmmaker named Aisha Patel. She was working on a project about chefs who'd overcome adversity, and she wanted to feature me. I was reluctant. I'd already done the magazine profile, and I worried about overexposure, but Aisha was persuasive. "This isn't about drama," she said. "It's about craft and resilience.
Let me show people what it takes to rebuild. I agreed, on the condition that the focus would be on the cooking, not the conflict. She filmed at both Moncour and Ember over the course of 2 months, capturing the morning prep routines, the dinner services, the quiet moments when Renata and I tested new recipes in the empty kitchen. The documentary premiered at a film festival the following spring and won an audience award. It brought a wave of new attention, but by then I'd learned how to manage it, how to stay grounded in the work rather than the noise around it. The winter was quiet and full. I spent my days moving between Moncour and Ember, tasting and teaching, making sure both kitchens maintained the standards that had earned the Michelin star. I also started working on a cookbook, a project I'd been avoiding for years because it felt too self-indulgent. But Renata convinced me it was worth doing. People want to know how you cook, she said, not just the recipes, but the why behind them. The cookbook became a way to honor my mother's memory, to collect the dishes that had shaped me, her cassoulet, the duck confit, the chocolate fondant, and pair them with the recipes I'd developed at Moncour and Ember. I wrote it in the early mornings before service, filling legal pads with ingredient lists and stories about where each dish came from. It was slow, painstaking work, but it felt right. In March, the James Beard Foundation announced the finalists for the Rising Star Chef Award. My name was among the 5. The ceremony was held in Chicago, a glittering event at the Lyric Opera House with chefs and journalists from across the country. I flew out with Renata and Claire, both of them giddy with excitement. When they called my name as the winner, the room erupted in applause, and I walked on stage in a daze. I thanked my team, my mother, the farmers and suppliers who'd believed in me. I didn't mention my father. I didn't need to. The award opened doors I hadn't expected. Restaurants reached out, asking if I'd consult on menu development. A culinary school invited me to teach a summer workshop. A publisher offered an advance for the cookbook, contingent on delivery within a year. I said yes to the projects that felt meaningful and no to the ones that didn't. I'd learned that success wasn't about accumulation. It was about focus, about knowing what mattered and protecting it fiercely. By the time summer returned, a full cycle complete, both Moncour and Ember were thriving in their own distinct ways. Moncour had reclaimed its place as one of Boston's most cherished dining rooms, a space where people came not for spectacle, but for food that made them feel cared for. Ember had earned its own Michelin star, a recognition that validated Miguel's talent and cemented its reputation as a destination worth seeking out. I'd built something sustainable, something that could outlast the noise and the conflict that had nearly destroyed it. One evening in late June, I stood in the courtyard behind Ember, watching Miguel and his team prep for service. The air smelled like rosemary and charcoal, and the fading sunlight turned the brick walls amber. I thought about my mother, about how she'd always said that feeding people was an act of love. I thought about my father, about the empire he'd tried to build at my expense, and how it had crumbled because he'd never understood that food couldn't be mass-produced or franchised without losing its soul. I thought about the long, hard months of rebuilding, the nights when I doubted whether I could pull it off, the moment I'd answered the phone and heard Sophie Lorent's voice telling me I'd earned a Michelin star. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I felt something quieter. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you fought for something and won, not because you were stronger or smarter, but because you refused to let go of what mattered. Moncour was mine again, and Ember was thriving, and the cookbook was slowly taking shape, page by page, recipe by recipe. The work would continue. There would always be new challenges, new dishes to create, new people to feed. But I was ready for it. I'd learned how to build from ashes, how to turn loss into something generative and whole. As the first dinner orders came in, I tied my apron and stepped back into the kitchen. The line was humming, the pans clattering, the air thick with heat and purpose. This was where I belonged. Not in a boardroom or a courtroom, but here, in the chaos and the craft, making food that mattered to the people who ate it. That was the empire I'd built, and it was enough.